Hello, today I'll be discussing moving into the Israeli market through an office relocation. So, what is Israel? Israel is a fairly new country located on the eastern Mediterranean coast. It has a strong high tech center and a strong startup culture. One important thing to note about Israel is that it contains Jerusalem, which is one of the most holy cities for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So, when you're moving to Israel, it's important that you stay in a good location. The Carlton Hotel in Tel Aviv is a great location because A, it is a very nice hotel that has a business center, conference rooms for anything that you might need for your business needs while you are there. Additionally, it's located in a great location as it is right by the water in a nice area, but it's also right by Tel Aviv, which is a major business center in Israel and is also a high tech leader. In many ways, Tel Aviv is called the new Silicon Valley. So being able to stay there and get yourself acquainted with the Tel Aviv market will help you expand into that tech center in Israel. Another thing that is important to take into consideration when you're moving into the Israeli market is geography. So location-wise, as I mentioned before, it is on the eastern Mediterranean Sea. But one thing that is unique about Israel is that it it is the only Jewish country in the Middle East. It's located in the Middle East, but it does not have the best relations with all the countries surrounding it. And geography, it is because it's in the Middle East, there are desert regions in the south, but it's also on the water. So there are areas where there are plains and areas of greater vegetation. But for the most part, Israel is a fairly dry country. Climate wise, as it's south of most of Europe and Canada, as you would mostly be used to, uh, it tends to be hotter, ranging from 12 to 20 degrees in the winter in the coastal zones and 8 to 14 degrees Celsius in the inland areas. It's also important to note that it does not get a ton of precipitation at only 105 and 125 millimeters respectively for the month of December. While the geography and location of Israel is very important, one of the most important things that you must take into consideration when doing business with Israel is its history. Israel has a long, complicated, and violent past. For the first half of 20th century, there was fighting between the Jews and Arabs in Palestine. This is primarily because the Jewish people originated from Jerusalem but were driven out centuries ago, and since then, Arabs and Islamic people have occupied the area. However, after World War II and the actions of the Nazis, the United Nations, and with the United Kingdom taking the lead, voted to partition Palestine and create a Jewish nation being Israel. And after a period of fighting in 1948, the state of Israel was proclaimed. So that goes into how Israel was formed, but what happened after Israel was formed? As it was the only Jewish nation in the area and it was forced upon the Middle Eastern region, many of those countries were not open to Israel being a thing, and they waged a war against Israel. However, Israel had the backing of many major powers such as the United States and the United Kingdom, so they were actually able to win that war. And in 1967, they were able to occupy the Sinai Peninsula, which is the region in the northeast of Egypt, as well as a few other areas to the north and east. Eventually, in 1979, Israel and Egypt signed a peace agreement which gained, uh, Egyptian recognition of Israel, which was extremely important because despite Israel being recognized by Western countries in the Middle East or that region in general, Israel was not recognized as a legitimate country. So by getting the recognition of Egypt, Israel was moving towards greater legitimacy in the region. Since then, in the 90s, the Israeli and Palestine Liberation Organization signed a peace accord which would gradually implement a Palestinian self-government West Bank and the Gaza Strip, which they have. However, during the 2000s, fighting between the two groups has continued, and now the Israelis actually occupy many of those regions that the peace accord discussed. And in general, there's a lot of tension in Israel right now between the Israelis and Palestinians. However, as we'll go into later, that does not necessarily mean it's a completely violent country. It is still a thriving country with a strong economy and doing very well globally. One of the reasons Israel is able to do well is that it has a very strong business sector. And this is partially supported by the fact that in Israel there is a required service in the military, meaning that there is much investment into security, innovation, technology, which is what Israel is actually known for. And as we'll go into culturally later, in addition to having this strong military area which promotes innovation, there's also a strong startup culture and lack of hierarchy in Israel, which promotes business. Additionally, the government actually goes out of their way to support local technology innovations, such as the Yozma from 1993, which integrated government funds for local technology and venture companies. And the final reason that Israel is able to do well in the business sector in general is because it has very strong allies in the United States and United Kingdom, which go out of their way to support the Israeli government and economy. So that goes into like the history of Israel and how they got to where they are now. But what is happening now in Israel? One current event with COVID is the vaccine rollout in Israel. Israel is the global leader in vaccine administration, with 11.55 people per 100 people being administered the vaccine. However, this is not without controversy, because one of the peace accords between the Palestinian self-government in the past and the Israeli government meant that the Palestinian government technically is in charge of administrating the healthcare to the people living in those regions. So Israel has chosen not to offer vaccines to those living in Palestinian-controlled areas, which has sparked some controversy. However, there are also many people praising Israel for its successful administration and efficient administration of the vaccine across its population. So right now, Israel is being both bashed and supported for its actions in relation to the vaccine. Despite its success in administering its vaccine to tons of people, they are still in a lockdown, meaning that their economy isn't going to be normal anytime soon, at least until the end of January. Another current event that is happening right now is that recently Israeli tanks struck a Hamas post in Gaza. While this sounds very bad at first glance, it is actually a result of the continued conflict between the Palestinians and Israel. In fact, this strike was a retaliation for 2 rockets fired from the Gaza Strip the previous day, which hit Nahal Oz, which is a region in southern Israel. And there were no injuries from the strike. But this current event just goes to show that even after all these years, there is still present conflict between the Palestinians and the Israeli government over who actually should control the land. With that in mind, and this conflict being such a big part of Israelis' history, you might be wondering, how does the media portray Israel? Well, one show on Netflix that sparked attention was The Messiah, because it was a very pro-Israeli show which depicted the Muslims living in Israel as evil. This was inaccurate to the actual culture in Israel, because many of the people actually living in Israel want some sort of peace to be achieved. They don't want the violence to go on forever, but it is primarily the government and the leaders of both sectors who are perpetuating the violence, because they want to win. They don't want a peace accord to be achieved. And in many ways, Israel is much safer than the show indicates, because overall, many people in Israel do very well. It is not a impoverished country, and on a daily basis, Jews and Muslims interact just fine. Another show which depicts this conflict is Munich, which is a 2005 film, which shows how during the 1972 Summer Olympics, a Palestinian group killed the Israeli Olympians. This was actually quite accurate, because it showed what the conflict actually has caused and what kind of things are a result of this continued conflict. And one thing that the movie did well was that it used real news clips, which helped portray an accurate depiction of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. As you're moving into the Israeli market, it's important to understand what the Israeli standards are. Israel, as a highly developed country, has many of the same standards as Canada. So there will not be many differences there. But one important thing to note is that the Standards Institution of Israel develops and establishes standards in Israel, and that they have a mutual recognition agreement with the United States over the following organizations on the right: the Department of Defense, ETL, FCC, IMPMO, NSF, and UL. This means that in many ways, the standards in Israel are also very similar to the United States. And outside of that, in general, the Israeli government is extremely open and encourages foreign investment because they want their business sector to grow. They are very open to new businesses and people coming into the Israeli market. When you're going into the Israeli market, you need to understand the demographics of Israel. Now, as I've mentioned before, it is not an impoverished country. The unemployment rate is only 4.7%, which is not very different from the United States and Canada. It has a growth rate of 8.4%, meaning that it is a growing country. The GDP is $395 billion, which is much smaller than some of the other larger countries in the world. But you have to remember, going back to the geography page, Israel's a very small country. Compared to the size of Canada and the United States, it could fit within one state or one province many times over. And then finally, looking at the average wage per month of $3,500 for USD, extrapolating this, that's over $35,000 a year, which is not at the same level as Canada or the United States. However, it is still a fairly high average wage for a year, meaning that when you go into Israel, products do not necessarily have to be targeted towards being extremely cheap or affordable. There are those in Israel who will be able to afford higher end products. As I've discussed the business sector in Israel being very strong, it is also important to note that of all the countries in the world, Israel has one of the lowest power distances. This does not mean that Israel has anything against people doing well in Israel, rather that there's a very informal business atmosphere in Israel, as in You do not have to treat your managers as superiors to you. You treat them as equals. There's a lot of interdependence between different people and organizations, as in the manager sees that the person working underneath him is just as important to the business as the manager himself or herself. There is decentralized power, and overall, there's just an egalitarian mindset present throughout Israel, as in no one is seen as inferior. This does not mean that it is a communist country, as in everyone has to perform equally, but in terms of opportunity and ability, in Israel, everyone is mostly treated as equals, as in they are all contributing to society in their own way. You can actually compare it to the UK and US, where it is less than half of what you see in those countries, just showing how informal it actually is and how egalitarian it actually is. With this informal power distance, you might think that they would also be willing to be wrong. However, in Israel, it has a fairly high uncertainty avoidance at 81. And this is primarily because, despite it being an egalitarian culture, productivity, precision, and security are very important to the Israeli culture. This, as someone who is experienced with the Israeli culture, I would go to say for your personal education that this might be a result of where Israel is located, in that because they're surrounded by countries that do not necessarily recognize Israel, there is a part of their culture who is saying, we have to do well, otherwise they will take us out, which is where productivity and security come into play. And this also plays into why there's less tolerance for ambiguity and uncertainty, because they just want to get things done and perform well. To do this, one thing that you'll see very commonly in Israel is hand gestures and expressive communication, such as you see with the man on the right using his hand while he's talking. In terms of individualism and collectivism, as in, is it a society where people are seen as having a duty in the collective good, or as in their individual merit? Israel actually has a very balanced blend of individualism and collectivism. There's a sense of duty, such as serving in the military and benefiting society. However, as I mentioned before, there is also a presence of people wanting to do well themselves. So there's a strong belief in self-actualization. But there's also a lot of loyalty to Israel. So in Israel, you'll see a healthy blend where there are small families, but people also want to do well themselves. And overall, it doesn't sway strongly towards either direction. The same holds true for masculinity versus femininity. There are masculine features such as performance being highly valued and assertive and expressive speech patterns. However, in the feminine side, people are seen as it's an egalitarian society, as we mentioned before, but also women have many high roles in the Israeli society. And in fact, compared to the US and Canada, women have a much larger role in the military and army in Israel than you would find in our countries. So overall, under the Hofstede cultural dimensions, how does Israel compare to Canada? Well, as I mentioned, Israel has one of the lowest power distance. Canada is also on the lower end, but Israel has an even more informal and egalitarian culture than you might find in Canada. In terms of uncertainty avoidance, Israel is very high in this respect, while Canada is lower. This is because in Canada, being wrong and being slightly less productive and accurate is seen as okay, while in Israel, they have a culture where being right and being productive is very important. This is honestly a trend you can see among almost all countries in Asia, where the uncertainty avoidance tends to be higher. In terms of individualism and collectivism, Israel is fairly balanced in this regard, but similarly to the United States, Canada has a much higher individualism score, meaning that in Canada, the self or the individual is seen more important than serving one's role in society. And in terms of masculinity and femininity, the two countries score fairly close in this regard, with Canada around 55 and Israel at 47. So in general, Canada tends to be a little more masculine, meaning it's a little more assertive and reaching to the top and showing off. But in general, like, you would not find major differences in this regard if you were doing business in either of the two countries. So when you're going to Israel, you are probably very curious about what kind of business customs are regular in Israel when you are going to do business with Israelis. Well, because of the informal culture in Israel, the dress code is usually fairly casual. However, here's a key distinction that you need to take into account. Despite there being an informal culture overall in Israel over dress, foreigners are actually expected to dress in clothing in general. So this is largely because they want you to show respect. So if you are going into a meeting with a group of Israeli businessmen or women, you should wear nicer clothing. Gifts are not necessary in Israel, but they are generally appreciated, especially if you are a foreign visitor. So for your own benefit, I would highly recommend when you're doing business in Israel that you bring a gift. In terms of greetings, they are fairly similar to what you might find in Canada, with handshakes being very common and formal language generally used when you're first meeting someone, and then this eventually becoming more informal as you get to know each other. That is largely because, as I mentioned before, loyalty is very important in Israel. Some other areas that you need to take into consideration when doing business in Israel are meeting structures. Compared to what you might find in Japan or some countries where it is very structured, Israeli business meetings tend to be a discussion. Bargaining is very common in business with Israelis, and it is very relaxed, a discussion before you get to negotiations, meaning that you have to be open to variety in how a meeting might go in Israel. Two things that we will go into later on are in more detail are why is work week and business hours. The work week in Israel is actually Sunday through Thursday, 8:30 a.m. to 6 p.m. This is because it is a Jewish nation and Friday and Saturday are reserved for Shabbat. Another thing that's very important is in Israel is respecting the political opinions of others in Israel. You might see in Canada and the United States that people can get very upset over the political views of others. However, in Israel, there's a strong culture of being okay with the views of others. So when you are going there, if someone says something that you don't agree with, you have to respect their opinion. Otherwise, it could be bad for your business. Additionally, Shabbat and religion is very important in Israel. You have to keep in mind that this is a Jewish country. They have the Jewish holidays, and the kosher diet is important. So do not try and serve food to someone in Israel without asking when it's not kosher. Otherwise, you could offend someone. Finally, as I've alluded to many times throughout this presentation, one of the most important things that you need to keep in mind when you're doing business with Israel is that it is the only primarily Jewish country on the planet. So unlike business in every other country, the practices, the holidays, the culture is going to be Jewish oriented, with over 74.3% of the population being Jewish. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, you have to respect the kosher diet, the holidays such as Shabbat, and Yom Kippur, and just respect the Jewish religion and practices in general, and this should help you do well in Israeli business. Thank you. And here's my reference slide. But just as an end note, Israel and Canada do business all the time. Israelis are very open to working with foreigners, but it's just important to remember that it's, generally speaking, a very informal, egalitarian society where you need to be direct and willing to talk to these people. They aren't just going to be straight to business. They care about getting to know you, trusting you, and knowing that you are someone that they want to work with. So when you're going to Israel, just make sure that you respect all of their cultural aspects, and you should be good. Thank you.